I'm really looking forward to getting back to commercials about irritable bowel syndrome. Like, we haven't seen those in a long time. I even miss the guy with the boat and the screen door in the bottom. Like that, I'm like, I miss that guy. There's only been political commercials for months, and I can't wait to see him again. But anyway, no matter how you're feeling about it, that was some of the punchlines from the late night shows this week. In 2 days, it's all over, but I have one more week. I've got about 30 minutes to talk to you this morning, and I'm really excited because I want to remind you about this series of verses that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks, and it's by a prophet who lived over 4,000 years ago, but he said these words. Daniel the prophet said, "Praise the name of God forever and ever, for he has all wisdom and power, and he controls the course of world events, and he removes kings, and he sets up other kings, and he gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge." I did that myself, Kate, don't forget. That was my own fault. "Gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the scholars. And he reveals the deep and mysterious things and knows what lies hidden in the darkness, though he is surrounded by light." And it has been so encouraging to me to be able to tell you that every week, and we believe this. And so I want to just sort of remind you of what we've learned, of what we've talked about so far, to kind of catch you up or to remind you if you have been here. But 2 weeks ago, we talked about this idea of sort of what it means to trust God, how this guy named Daniel, who saw his city be besieged by the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who actually after probably 18 months to 3 years, but probably at least 2 years of sickness and disease and famine and arrows flying over the wall and people dying all around him, and you know in that situation he's praying for God to rescue them. God doesn't rescue them. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, comes in, destroys Jerusalem, and to make it even worse, like his temple, the temple of the God of Israel, is raided, and the sacred objects are taken back to the heathen gods, the heathen idols, they believe, of Babylon. So he sort of sees, and if that isn't enough to sort of shake his faith, he's kidnapped and forced to work for the government of Babylon. And yet, in spite of that, he later wrote those words that we just read, how he said that God is in control. God can be trusted, which are two different things. Like, God could be in control and not have our best interests at heart. But Daniel said the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, the Father of Jesus as Christians, not only is in control, he can be trusted and his ways are right. And as followers of Jesus today, that's still what Jesus' followers believe, that God is in control, that he ultimately controls everything, but not only that, he has our best interests and his ways are right again and again. Now, last week, we sort of went a step past that and said, maybe that's what it means to trust God, but why you should trust God. And I know this was sort of annoying to some of you, but I said, and I believe that the reason why you should trust God, why if there wasn't a God, we should invent one, the reason why we need a God as humans is 2 reasons. Like, we can't see the future. And that's what we're talking about in this election. We're really worried not about which candidate, and that's sort of here or there. We'll forget. Honestly, it's funny. In like 8 years, you won't even remember who ran. It's interesting, like how that passes. And it's not about the parties. It's not even about our principles. In the end, what people are arguing about, what people are so passionate about, is like what the best future is. And the problem with that, as we discussed last week, is we can't see the future, and the truth is, even though it's hard to admit, we don't even know what's going to bring the best outcome. Because history tells us, and we can learn looking backwards, that it usually takes 40 to 80 years before we even know if a president was a good president or what they planned to actually worked or if it actually had bad outcomes no one saw. So we'll be dead, or at least I will. Some of you will be alive because you're younger and don't eat the things I eat. But most of us, some of us at least, will be dead before we even know what the outcome of this election is. But what Daniel said is, but. The answer to every one of those questions was, but there is a God in heaven. So this week I want to talk to you not about what it means to trust God, not about sort of why we should trust God. I think in this final week of this series and right before the election, I want to tell you how to trust God. From Daniel, I'm not telling you, what do I know? But this idea from Daniel is how to trust God no matter what. And that's important, right? Because here's the thing to remember. Like, the calendar actually doesn't end on May 9th, right? Like, there's going to be a Wednesday, or May 8th. There's going to be a Wednesday, May 9th. There's going to be May 10th, and life is going to go on, whether or not your candidate wins, or whether the thing you fear most happens, or whatever happens, life is going to go on. And I want to just share with you really quickly this morning a foolproof way to trust God no matter what. No matter if you're happy, no matter if you're sad, and as I believe, like, we're really not going to know even after we know who wins. And here's the thing you can look forward to. I will make one prediction about the election. The thing we're really voting on is what kind of lawsuits we're going to have. Because there's going to be investigations and lawsuits, I will guarantee you, after this election, and we just get to decide if they're civil or criminal. So look forward to that. It's kind of like the sequel you don't want to see, because that's coming. But here's the thing I know, is that we need to know how to trust God no matter what. And so I just want to read to you, and I'm going to tell you some of the story, but I want to read this first part of Daniel chapter 3. We've basically talked about Daniel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 2, and now in Daniel chapter 3, things change, because if you remember, or if you know the story, or if you were here last week, Daniel comes as a slave to Babylon with his three friends, sort of defies the king's order to eat the food that he demands he eats, and basically says, hey, I believe God is right, so just try it. You know, I'll bet my life that I'll be better in 10 days. So they're promoted. And then they have they go, oh, wow, that's great. We're going to be leaders in Babylon. This isn't turning out as bad as we thought. And then we find out Nebuchadnezzar is extremely smart and extremely crazy, because he's like, hey, I had a dream, and if you don't tell me the dream and interpret the dream, you're dead. And so we find that Daniel prays and actually interprets a great dream, gets promoted again. So far, this has been sweet. Like, they keep getting promoted. Daniel, the prophet, is now second in command in the land of Babylon, and which by extension is most of the world. And his three friends are actually in charge of that region. And so it's really just this amazing trajectory. Life is great until one day Nebuchadnezzar sort of throws a monkey wrench on the whole thing. And verse 1 says, King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Subtle, yet nice, I think. People would approve of that. And set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. I have a great joke that I'm not going to say here. And then he sent messages to his high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all of these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, people of all races and nations and languages. And the reason why he would say that, because Nebuchadnezzar did exactly what he did to Israel. Like, he would go and conquer a place, find sort of the best and brightest, kidnap them, bring them back. And so he had this cabinet and officials made up from people. It was like the UN of that time, only the smartest, not the dumbest. So he had like the best of all the people, but he says, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, or the harp and the pipes, the band, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. And because he's Nebuchadnezzar, anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, the thing that kind of stuck out to me as I'm reading this, and I've read this a million times, but was just thinking like, oh, wow. I used to sort of think this was everyone, like bring everyone, but that wouldn't even been possible. Like, it was a huge nation, and they had conquered all the nations. So it wasn't a fact of like everyone in the country has to come bow before the statue. That's the way I always sort of pictured it. But actually, it says he sent messages to basically his cabinet, officials, governors, only leaders. Now, why that's interesting to me and what that made me think of is, if you've been following along with the story, or if you know the story, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his three friends just got promoted sort of into that position. So the fact that they're there, we don't know where Daniel was. Daniel might have been traveling from what we think, but it mentions his three friends were there at that moment only because they had been promoted. So here's three guys sort of going, hey, God is in control. We can trust him. God can be trusted. He has our best interest at heart, and God's ways are right. You know, like, let's not argue with God. Whatever God says, we'll do it. Now, the interesting thing is that brought this conflict. Like the same thing that got them promoted, the fact that they wouldn't sort of bow down before and eat what the king said if it violated their religion, or they prayed and God gave Daniel the interpretation of the dream. All of those things had worked out wonderfully until this point, which got them promoted, which got them put in this situation where once again, their life is in danger. I mean, it's interesting how that works. And so the story continues. It says, so at the sound of the musical instruments, all of the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed the Jews. Another thing to remind you and sort of to go back is that when Daniel interpreted the king's dream in the story last week, he saved the lives of the astrologers because they were going to be killed for not interpreting the dream, and no good deed goes unpunished, I guess, back then, just like today. The guys that he'd saved their lives go and inform on them. And they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the band. And that decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's friends, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon, jealous much. They pay no attention to you, your majesty, and they refuse to serve your gods, and they do not worship the gold. Isn't that amazing? And as I read that and I thought through this, I thought, well, this just makes sense in life, doesn't it? Because, see, trusting God will eventually cost you something every time. Now, salvation, we say this a lot around here, like salvation is completely free, like having your sins taken away, accepting the free gift of salvation, accepting the fact that Jesus died on your cross to pay the price for your sins, absolutely free, but following him will cost you something because this will happen at some point. Not you'll be thrown into a furnace if you don't bow. That could happen. Doubtful, but not this particular thing. But at some point when we trust God, it's not just sort of like this escalator to greatness and comfort. Like so far in the story, it has been like they went through a bad time in Jerusalem, they believed in God, and everything they did sort of pleased the king. The more they trusted God, the more they got promoted. But isn't it interesting that at some point, now if we read that story and we didn't have this part, we would just think, well, if I trust God and I do the right thing at work or in my home or, hey, at school, I trust God and I do what the Bible says, then I'll be okay. I'll get promoted. I'll always have a great time. I'll always be top. Not true, because in this case, those very things that put them there, those very things, like God definitely had favor on them, and here they are like rulers in that land in a matter of a short time. I mean, it's an amazing story, but all of a sudden, that puts them at conflict with the king. Like they're in a position, and I will guarantee you one thing this morning: if you trust God, and if you do what he says, and you just go, hey, God can be trusted, God is in control, and his ways are right, at some point it will cost you something because you will come in conflict with the world around you. And that's what happened to these guys. Because they have to choose at that point, like, are we going to obey God? And I mean, rule number one was, thou shalt have no other gods before me. They couldn't bow down to any other gods. And all of a sudden they're in a situation where they're standing and a crowd of tens of thousands probably, they're all kneeling, and these three guys are standing there because eventually trusting God costs you something. There's conflict that comes from that. And so then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage, and he ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance. He's actually being pretty, I'd say for Nebuchadnezzar, sort of reasonable and kind here. I'll give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue. And when you hear the sound of the musical instruments, but if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then he throws in this kicker. And then what God will be able to serve you? Now, it's interesting that he's saying, like, I'm going to give you one more chance, which actually for Nebuchadnezzar seems pretty reasonable and kind. But he's saying, like, nothing will rescue you from me. Your God will never be able to rescue you from me. Now, once again, I don't want to make this about whether you know this story or whether you were here last week, because I'm glad you're here no matter what. But last week, at the very end of chapter 2, it's interesting that this very guy, Nebuchadnezzar, said these words. Truly, he said this to Daniel after he interpreted the dreams, truly your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you will be able to reveal the secret. And he goes on to say that no other God, no other king was above the God of Israel, but yet, just a short time later, he's going, hey, I have all power over you. No one's going to rescue you. What's your God going to... It's just an interesting sort of change that happens. And it sort of brings us to this point that we all have to face. Like, how do you trust God when it gets all real up in here? I mean, when you get to this moment like they did, like... They had trusted God up to this point. I'm not saying that they didn't have strong faith. I mean, it's amazing when you look back that somehow they had kept their faith through the siege of their country. They had kept their faith through being captured by the Babylonians. They had kept their faith when the temple is destroyed and looted and the golden objects are taken back to Babylon. Again and again, like many people would have lost their faith, and I'm sure many people lost their faith along the way, but these guys had strong faith. But at some point, they trusted God when they had to stand up when everybody else bowed down. Like they came to this place where, and this is not going to go away. This is not a slap on the wrist. This is life and death, and we have to choose, do we really trust God? Do we really believe his ways are best? You know, do we really think that commandment about you shall have no gods before me really applies to me? You know, or can we sort of bend that rule a little bit? Because God, you know, if I'm not alive, I can't praise you. We make all sorts of like rationalizations when it comes to this point in life where we go, well, do you mean I have to be honest all the time? I mean, there's got to be some exception to the rule, or God, I can't. You know, it's amazing though when it comes to this moment. And it will come to this moment for all of you. I guarantee if you will actually trust God and you will actually follow him. And let me say this. If I could help you in any way, I can't tell you how it is. And I don't even pretend to know, like, you know, we can all sort of sit here and go, well, I'd stand up, or, oh man, I would have been bowing down immediately. Like I would have acted like I was going to tie my shoe or something, you know, like some way I would have got out of it. And so I don't know, like you and I can sit here and go, I would have bowed or I would have stood up. That's not super helpful because we're not there. But I will tell you that trusting God, this thought of like, how am I going to trust God when it gets real? It's a decision, and it's not a feeling. That's the one thing I can tell you that's going to be super helpful to you when you get to that situation, if you have not already. Because we can have all sorts of feelings. Like, I don't think for a moment they felt good about their decision to stand up. I don't think they were like fists in the air pumping, you know, yeah, look at us. I think like that had to be like the worst moment, knowing they were probably giving their lives. But that's a weird thing to do, isn't it? It's a weird thing to go, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to decide to trust God, even when I don't feel like it. I'm going to decide in advance to trust God, even when it doesn't make sense. I'm going to decide to trust God, even when sort of, like in their case, everybody else does the opposite. Well, I had a situation this week I wanted to tell you about. We finally got a new kitchen installed in our house. We've lived in our house for 20 years. It's weird how like your new house is suddenly the 20-year-old house. Life goes by fast. And we started planning a kitchen remodel like I think back in like December or something. And sort of the process has been going on. And we actually got it built by someone in Michelle's family. And it's kind of a neat story because he had a cabinet making shop and agreed to do it. He's retiring this year. And I know one thing, like we live in a youth culture, you know, like you really don't go, hey, I think I want the guy right before he retires to be on my, I don't know, NBA team. That probably wouldn't work out well, or DJ my party. But the thing about a cabinet maker, or somebody who's a skilled craftsman like that, like there's nothing better than the guy who's been doing it for 45 years. It's just amazing like what he can do. So this is a guy who's 64. He's retiring next year, selling his shop. He's, I think he said he had one more kitchen booked after us. So literally this is almost his last kitchen that he's doing. Just an amazing, amazing craftsman. Well, finally, after this long process, finally the cabinets are built. He showed up last Sunday afternoon to our house. And I actually had this conversation with him, almost exactly this conversation, not, hey, his name's Gary. Gary, I'm going to trust God. I didn't tell him that. That wasn't, but it was almost the same conversation because what I told him, I realized something about me. Like I'm used to being the boss. I didn't say a good boss, but I'm usually the boss everywhere I'm at. You know, and I'm usually working by myself, and I usually make decisions and don't take direction. It's been years since I've worked for anyone. And I also realized like I'm the homeowner in this situation, and I paid for the cabinets, you know, or was part of paying for the cabinets with Michelle. So I paid for the cabinets. And so there was like every reason for me to kind of go, hey, I'm in charge and I'm going to tell Gary what to do. And that's my every instinct. But I made a decision and I told him this. I said, hey, I'm going to take a couple of days off. And I actually want to be a helper to you because I know like as a painting contractor, like a lot of times if a homeowner would say, hey, I'm just going to take a couple of days off and help you, you're like, no, like it's going to take twice as long and I'm going to charge you twice as much if you help. But so I told him, I said, here's the deal. You know more than I do. You're the boss. I don't know cabinetry. I don't know. I'm not a skilled carpenter. I can do a few things, but send me the truck for tools. I just basically want to be your helper, and I'll do what you say. Now, it was weird because I was good with that for about 17 minutes. Like, honestly, like I made this speech to him because I want to let him know that I'm going to be help. We started like immediately, and that was exciting to me because I like to get going. We started pulling things off the truck, and that made sense to me. And then I was like, man, where do we start? And he's like, we got to put this cabinet up in the corner, and that's going to be the anchor. That made total sense to me. And then we put another couple cabinets up last Sunday afternoon, and I'm like getting excited, like starting to look like kitchen already. I'm like, we'll have this done by like 6:30 tonight. Like, you know, and he had told me it was going to take 3 days. And I was like, there's no way this is going to take, you know, like with my awesome help, we'll be done tonight, you know. So we got like 3 cabinets in. And I was like, man, this is great. Let's keep the momentum up. And I started bringing the other upper cabinets in. I'm like, man, we'll slam all the other uppers up. I started telling him what to do. I'm like, we'll slam all the other uppers up tonight. We'll finish up the others tomorrow. We'll be great, you know. He's like, no, we don't do it that way. And I was like, oh. And all of a sudden I had to remember my decision, like I'm going to trust Gary, the cabinet maker. And so he goes and says, tomorrow morning we'll put in the sink base. And I was like, we're going to stop right here. And so I had a conversation with him later. And it was interesting because I was like, just asking, I told you I'd do what you say, like, why don't we slam the rest of the upper? And he's like, well, realize we got to bring the top in and join it together and fit it to the wall. And if we don't do that, like if we put the other ones up, we'll have to be sliding it under and working under it and bumping our heads. And I was like, well, why put up any? And he's like, well, we need those to measure off. He had this great, like sort of, it made perfect sense once I understood because he knew how the cabinet was designed. He had built them and he had a plan I didn't understand at all until the whole project was done. I was like, oh, that's why he does things like he did. And guys, I will tell you, as I was thinking about this later, I wasn't like trying to make some sort of sermon illustration, but as I got to the end of my week and I looked at this slide that I had made, I'm like, oh, that's it. Like the best thing that I could have done last week, and by the way, it took exactly as long as he said, and they look beautiful, and had I done it my way, they would have been awful probably. I could have ruined them. Like it's so funny, like I always go, well, I'm a pretty good carpenter. I measure, you know, twice and I cut once. You know, I think that's awesome. Gary is like a craftsman, and so he like measures once, cuts once, measures again, cuts again, sands for a while. I mean, it's just so agonizing, but everything is perfect. And I thought, that's a lot like God. Like, if we as followers of Jesus believe that God designed this universe, that he is outside of time and is eternal and doesn't have 45 years of experience, has 4 billion years of experience, and has a plan that we can't see, we would be the smartest thing that we could do, any of us, is sort of step back and go, I'll listen to you because you know way more than I do. And I will tell you, that is a decision, not a feeling, because there was 1,000 times over the few days that I worked with Gary that I had a really strong feeling we were going the wrong direction. You know, I was like, if I were in charge, we wouldn't be. But the interesting thing is, just that decision I made, and that kind of like, oh, I know, I told him I'd listen to him, so I'm going to do that. I will tell you today, I am so happy I did. And see, that's the thing. I think that I would say the same to you about life, about this election, about everything. Like, you'll never be sorry trusting God. And I know that's not a perfect example because neither Gary's not God, I'm not God. We both have to answer to a higher power. Michelle, it's her, my wife's kitchen. So we did have to, that's God in this story. But anyway, you'll never be sorry, and you're going to have to make a decision like they did. And I just want to read this, and chapter 3 continues. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied. And notice this decision that they make, because it's that same thing of going, here's the deal. I may not understand, I may not like it, I may not feel it, but, oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. Which he must have thought, oh, yes, you do. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. And he will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we'll never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious that his face becomes distorted with rage, and he commanded the furnace be heated 7 times hotter. I love the way Nebuchadnezzar rolls, even though he's evil, because he's just crazy. And then he ordered some of his strongest men of the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. And this, my friends, is the essence of what it means to believe God and go, hey, I'm not changing because God is in control, God can be trusted, and God's ways are right. So I'm sorry, I can't bow down, I can't do what everyone else says, but I believe my God will save me. But, I was looking at this, I was like, oh my goodness, this is truly the essence of making a decision to trust God. Because what do they say? Not our God will save us, they go, but even if he doesn't. We want to make it clear we're not going to bow. See, that's the essence of what it means to trust God, to believe that he is in control, to believe that he can be trusted, has our best interest at heart, and his ways are right, is to go, God can rescue us, but even if he doesn't, I'm not changing. And here's the way this story goes down. If you don't know it, it's worth reading because it's hilarious and fantastic. It says, so they tied them up. Well, maybe not for these guys, but anyway, it's not a little dark. It's wonderful. They tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, their turbans, their robes, and their other garments. I love the detail. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't I tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed. And the 4th looks like a god. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out from the fire. And the high officers, the officials, the governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed. and their clothing was not scorched, and they didn't even smell like smoke. And I love this part of the story, to imagine that even though they weren't rescued, they had no idea they were going to be rescued. Literally, they're going into the furnace. They kept their word. They trusted God, but they weren't alone. They were never alone. In fact, we don't know if it was an angel, maybe Jesus, but someone else was waiting for them. And the story ends this way. It says, then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. And they defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Once again, I love how he always goes for some really violent threat and follows through. He's not into idle threats. This is an endorsement. If you want an endorsement for your church, imagine this. If you speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb. Their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble, for there is no other God who can rescue like this. Then the king promoted them again to even higher positions. So that's our story. That happened thousands of years ago, but I just want to recap, and I want to remind you sort of what it means to trust God, how and why. And I hope you remember these things over the next couple days and weeks that come. So what we believe, you talk about, well, what does a follower of Jesus believe? Does it matter what you believe? Yeah, it does. Not a set of facts, not sort of history, not believe these verses, but God is in control. We have to believe that if we are followers of Christ, because that means he's the king, that God can be trusted. He has our best interests at heart, and God's ways are right. And those simple things, if we believe them like Daniel did, change everything. And we admit as humans that we can't see the future, even though we'd like to think that we can, even though it feels like we can. You know, we just admit it, like we don't know what the future holds, and we don't even know, like, truthfully, what's positive and negative. We don't know what's best. God knows what's best. And this is a tough thing. This is the thing that you'll have to decide on your own. And I can't do it for you, and I can't tell you if you've done it. But if you decide, like Daniel, that God can save us from anything, but even if he doesn't, we will serve him. But here is the thing I can promise you. All those things are things you're going to have to decide. Those are things you're going to have to believe or not believe. Those are the things that you're going to have to admit to yourself or be proud like I am most of the time. Go, no, I know better. I know what's best. But you have to do those things on your own. But I just want to remind you the purpose of sort of gathering here, the whole purpose of having this building and these chairs and gathering together is that we are together in that process. Just like, I think it's so amazing, and we don't know where Daniel was during this process at all, but I love the fact that God allowed these three to be together, even in this horror. I don't know how it would have turned out singly, but I know that he allowed them to go through this test together. And in the end, I love the picture of like they follow through and are thrown into the furnace, and God sort of sends an angel or someone to meet them there in the fire. And that's what I would say to you as a church. I don't know where you're at in the belief part. I don't know if you admit to yourself you don't know the future, or if you're still like 99.9% of us who think that we know the future. And I don't know where you are in your trust in God. But I can tell you this, whatever happens Tuesday, whatever happens Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and all through the week, we don't have to be alone. We don't have to go through it alone. That's the beautiful thing about this church and the churches all around that believe these things. God never called us to do it on our own. And I want the band to come back up here, and I want to pray with you and pray for you. And quite frankly, remind you that he is in control. But I want to remind you most of all that this church, this place, we're here to do exactly this, to trust God together and to go through whatever together and to just sort of say together that God can rescue us from anything, but even if he doesn't, we will serve him. And so I'd like to pray with you this morning. Dear Jesus, we don't know what the future holds. And quite frankly, I don't even know what's best this morning. That's every morning, but I am admitting that to you this morning. But God, I pray that a growing number of people here this morning and in our community would gather together and go, hey, we believe that God is able to rescue us. We believe that God is in control. We believe that he can be trusted and his ways are right. And we'll follow him and he can rescue us no matter what. But even if he doesn't, even when times are bad, even when everything seems to be going opposite the way it should go, we are going to trust and we are going to believe. And God, I pray that you would bless this place. And God, I pray that you would help us to not just be individuals going through life alone, sort of gathering together once a week to hear someone talk, hear a band play. But God, we would be a place that go through these things together. And God, we thank you for the strength that that brings, and we thank you most of all for your Son. In your name we pray. Amen.